Yeah, they were the military minds behind some of the Third Reich's most devastating conquests. Yet barely 10 years after the ashes of Nazi Germany had cooled, these same commanders returned to uniform. This time, not to subjugate Europe, but to stand guard over it. This is the account of how Hitler's former generals were transformed into the founding architects of West Germany's democratic armed forces. They would no longer serve a dictator, but instead became the key strategists on NATO's new front line, defending the very continent they had once helped to destroy. General Hans Speidel, in the summer of 1944, General Hans Speidel made a critical choice that positioned him at the heart of the resistance against the Nazi regime. As a central figure in the July 20th plot to assassinate the Führer, Speidel staked his life on the effort to topple the dictatorship, serving as chief of staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. On the Western Front, Speidel possessed both the high-level access and the strategic overview required for the conspiracy. While historians still debate the extent of Rommel's personal involvement, Speidel operated clandestinely. He managed defenses against the Allied invasion, while simultaneously aiding the plot to remove Hitler. Following the failed bombing, the regime launched a brutal purge. The Gestapo arrested Speidel, imprisoning him in Berlin. However, through calculated denials and by keeping his connection to the plot undocumented, he escaped the firing squad that claimed thousands of others. He remained in custody until the war's end. In the post-war era, Speidel's background made him unique. Unlike most of his contemporaries, he had a verified record of resistance. This made him politically viable for Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. In 1950, Adenauer named Speidel his military advisor, a position from which he helped draft the blueprint for the Bundeswehr. When the new West German military was officially founded in 1955, Speidel was among its first generals. His combat experience across two world wars provided the strategic depth the West urgently required. By 1957, he was named Commander of Allied Land Forces Central Europe, placing him in command of NATO troops. From a Gestapo prison cell, then he sought NATO command. Speidel's trajectory mirrored the rehabilitation of West Germany itself. He had evolved from a German general into a Cold War architect, defending a new alliance. However, not every commander's return was built on resistance. Some had stood right beside Hitler and still found a path back to influence. General Adolf Heusinger. On July 20th, 1944, Lieutenant General Adolf Heusinger was standing mere feet away from Adolf Hitler within the Wolf's Lair. He was in the midst of a situation report regarding the Eastern Front when the briefcase bomb detonated. The blast knocked Heusinger to the floor and injured him. While killing 4 others like Hitler, Heusinger survived. At that moment, Heusinger served as Chief of Operations for the Army High Command. This station put him at the nerve center of the Nazi war effort. From the fall of France to the invasion of Russia, he had been instrumental in planning and executing massive military campaigns. In the aftermath of the explosion, the Gestapo swept up suspects. Although wounded, Heusinger was arrested and interrogated. Yet despite his high rank, investigators could not find sufficient proof linking him to the conspiracy. He escaped the executioner, surviving by the slimmest of margins. This ambiguous status, neither a full conspirator nor a condemned war criminal, defined his post-war future. As West Germany moved to rearm, he became indispensable. But in 1957, Heusinger was named the first Inspector General of the Bundeswehr, serving as the nation's top-ranking soldier. The Soviet Union issued fierce protests, labeling him a war criminal for actions on the Eastern Front. But these accusations gained no traction in the West. For NATO, Heusinger offered institutional memory and professional reliability in the face of the Cold War. By 1961, he ascended even higher. When he became the chairman of the NATO Military Committee, the first German to hold the post. The image was powerful. A man who once designed invasions for the Third Reich was now coordinating Western defense. For some, his return was a pragmatic necessity. for others a disturbing compromise. Ultimately, it reflected the reality of the nuclear age where military expertise was a valuable currency and past allegiances could be overlooked. General Friedrich Foch. On September 5, 1944, General Friedrich Foch received the Knight's Cross for his leadership in one of the war's most brutal theaters. As Chief of the General Staff for the 18th Army, he directed operations during the Siege of Leningrad, a battle marked by attrition and immense civilian suffering. The 900-day siege resulted in over 1 million deaths from hunger and bombardment. But Foch's role in managing the German defense against Soviet counterattacks placed him at the center of the collapsing Eastern Front. By early 1944, as the Red Army broke through, Foch's forces were driven back. They were trapped in the Courland Pocket in Latvia, where over 200,000 German troops were encircled. It was here that Foch was eventually captured, ending his war in Soviet custody. Years later, a Soviet tribunal sentenced him to 25 years in prison for war crimes, specifically citing the destruction of civilian infrastructure during the German retreat, while many of his peers were executed. Foch's time in captivity was relatively brief. In 1955, after serving only 5 years, he was released. The timing was deliberate. West Germany was rearming to counter the Soviet bloc. Foch, with his intimate knowledge of Soviet tactics, was considered too valuable to discard. In 1961, he succeeded Heisinger as Inspector General of the Bundeswehr. The appointment sparked controversy immediately. Critics at home and abroad asked how a convicted war criminal could lead a democratic military. However, in the high-stakes environment of the Cold War, his utility outweighed his baggage. His command began during a crisis, as the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, yet his career would end due to a political scandal just a year later, the Spiegel affair. In October 1962, the magazine Der Spiegel published an expose titled Conditionally Prepared for Defense, based on leaks from the NATO exercise Phalanx 62. The report revealed that despite government claims, the Bundeswehr was incapable. The scandal forced Defense Minister Franz Josef Strauss to resign, though Foch remained in office until his retirement as a 4-star general on December 31, 1963. General Heinz Trettner. During the war's final months, Heinz Trettner acted as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, managing the crumbling defense of northern Italy, though the Third Reich was collapsing. Trettner's military utility was far from exhausted. Trettner was a Luftwaffe veteran and a pioneer of airborne warfare. He cut his teeth in the Spanish Civil War with the Condor Legion. His defining moment occurred in 1941 with Operation Mercury, the airborne invasion of Crete. This was history's first major assault conducted entirely by paratroopers. While successful, the victory came with heavy casualties. Trettner's command established him as an innovator in airborne tactics. After a brief internment by the Allies, he was released. In 1956, he joined the Bundeswehr, bringing decades of aviation experience. By 1964, he was named Inspector General. However, his rise drew sharp condemnation from the East German officials attacked the appointment, accusing Trettner of involvement in the bombing of Guernica. Trettner faced bureaucratic battles. He clashed repeatedly with the civilian Deputy Minister of Defense, particularly over the chain of command. The final straw came when the ministry allowed military personnel to unionize. Viewing this as fatal to discipline, Trettner resigned in protest in 1906, ending his 2-year tenure as the nation's top soldier. General Hans Rödiger. In the winter of 1942, Hans Rödiger commanded panzer forces during the disastrous Stalingrad offensive. There, he learned hard lessons about the limits of German armor. Promoted to general of panzer troops in January 1945, Rödiger was tasked to negotiate the surrender in Italy. However, the German command was fracturing on April 30th, just as Rödiger attempted to meet the new commander. He was detained by his own side as they tried to maintain the fight. Following the final surrender in May, Rödiger became a prisoner of the Western Allies until 1948. As a tank expert, Rödiger had helped perfect the Blitzkrieg. Now the West needed that expertise to counter the massive Soviet tank armies threatening Central Europe. In 1950, Rödiger attended the Himmerod Conference. There, former officers secretly drafted the plans for West German rearmament. These plans laid the groundwork for the Bundeswehr upon the Army's formation in 1955. Rödiger became its first inspector. He was responsible for creating a force that fit NATO's defensive needs, shifting focus from offensive conquest to territorial protection. Although he died of cancer in 1960, his influence remained his lasting legacy. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge. As the Allies prepared to storm Europe in 1944, Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge worked with Rommel to fortify the Atlantic Wall, a specialist in naval mines and coastal defense. Ruge designed the underwater obstacles intended to stop the invasion fleet, though these defenses ultimately failed to stop D-Day. His technical expertise was undeniable. Ruge, a Knight's Cross recipient, was known for his intellect. And after being released from captivity in 1946, he worked as a writer and translator. When Chancellor Adenauer began considering a new Navy, Ruge was the natural choice for a consultant. He helped design the new maritime force from the ground up. In 1955, Ruge became the first inspector of the Navy. Under his guidance, the German Navy transitioned from the surface raider strategy of Hitler's era. Ruge focused the new Bundesmarine on securing the Baltic Sea and specializing in anti-submarine warfare to counter the Soviet fleet. General Joseph Kammhuber. As Allied bombers turned German cities into infernos, General Joseph Kammhuber developed a sophisticated defense network to stop them. The Kammhuber Line was a system of radar stations and flak batteries. Kammhuber's mastery of electronic warfare and night fighting earned him a reputation as the Luftwaffe's top defensive strategist. He analyzed bombing tactics and created a technical response that was years ahead of its time. As the Cold War began, the threat of nuclear-armed Soviet bombers made Kammhuber's specific skill set essential for the West. Released from captivity in 1948, he spent years refining his theories on air defense. In 1956, he was appointed the first inspector of the German Air Force. Kammhuber oversaw the acquisition of jet fighters and the integration of German air power into NATO's defensive grid. He successfully transformed the remnants of the Luftwaffe into a modern democratic air force. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for watching. We hope you found this video informative.